It is now 3:30 in Paris. I don't know exactly, Dzul, what time is it on your side?
It's 10:30. I'm supposed to go to bed.
Oh, okay. So we will be fast. Noah and Larissa, I think you're on the same continent, no? So it's about 3:30 on your side, 2:30?
And 9:30 in Ottawa.
9:30 in the morning, okay.
8:30 in Chicago in the morning.
Okay, okay, very good. And I think that if I asked our audience, they would have many different times to give us. So I would like to give you all a very warm welcome to this third plenary of what already has proven to be a very rich and successful conference. Even if held online, the hosts have been very generous and managed to organize for a real sense of togetherness. They managed to involve us as participants as if we were together in real time to debate the important topics on the agenda. And that is a real tour de force, and I applaud that. IU is proud and very pleased to be an official partner of this event, not only because of the many friends and colleagues from around the world that we know, but also to meet so many more new colleagues for the future. It allows to bring us all together, but as well, it is important because it allows to discuss so many topics and with very high quality debates. Developing this dialogue between internationalization dynamics and sustainable development is key to the future development of education and of higher education more particularly so. We have discussed many different aspects of the juncture between the two dynamics, the global transformation of the university as an institution, a system, and a sector. Also the imperative for universities to engage fully in Agenda 2030 and help address the SDGs while pursuing the many other activities in teaching and learning, research, and community engagement. The need as well to better connect to the local and the need to connect the local and the global. The future of higher education is being designed as we speak, and I'm very honored to give the floor to the three distinguished speakers who I will present in a minute. The theme of our plenary is again a very important one in the sequencing of this conference. One very important one because so many people are wondering what actually will be the future of higher education. What will be higher education also more specifically in a post-COVID-19 era? And it questions the future roles of higher education for society. The overarching idea that led to the organization of this very session is related to the work carried out in the context of UNESCO's Future of Education initiative, Learning to Become. And IU is very pleased to sit on the advisory committee to this initiative, and thus for me to be able to chair this session. The Futures of Education initiative, and you will say that as well, Noah, but still, the initiative aims to reimagine how knowledge and learning can shape the future of humanity and the planet. The initiative as well is designed as a co-construction process that activates public engagement, expert inputs, and that is what we're doing here. The initiative also looks at the implication for higher education in the 21st century in a post-pandemic world. So this session in itself, I hope, will be seen as a constructive contribution to this broader endeavor. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to present on their perspectives on the future of higher education, and then we will have Q&A session. So please add your questions in the chat box. But before introducing the speakers, let me also welcome the two session rapporteurs, Sally Abu Saba and Mirko Stella, and the moderators, Mary Rose Tala and Lisa Endersby. Thank you for being with us. Please note as well that at the end of this session, a pre-recorded cultural contribution is also set for you to appreciate after the session. So please stay on. So I'm pleased to introduce three very eminent speakers, very knowledgeable on the topic and presenting very different views. And I will start by giving the floor to you, Noah Sobe. You're the Senior Project Officer on the Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO, where you help to lead the Future of Education initiative, Learning to Become. You're past president of the Comparative and International Education Society, CIES, and you're on leave from a faculty position as professor of cultural and educational policy studies at Loyola University in Chicago. So we're very pleased to invite you to introduce maybe some of the topics you would like to share with the audience on the Future of Education initiative and way beyond. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elise, and colleagues and everyone for being here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As Elise just mentioned, I helped to lead on the UNESCO's new Futures of Education initiative, which is really centering around how we use knowledge and learning to shape the futures we want for humanity and for the planet. So what I'll do in my 10 minutes is introduce this project, talk a little bit how COVID has shaped it, reshaped it, and then identify some of the kind of key concerns around sustainability and how they're entering in the project at the moment. So this is an sort of assess the state of the field envisioning exercise that UNESCO has undertaken every quarter century, basically every generation. So the Futures of Education and Learning to Become initiative follows in the footsteps of two previous UNESCO global reports, the 1972 FOR Commission, Learning to Be, and the 96 Delors Commission report, Learning the Treasure Within. Whether you're familiar with those or not, what's important is that in this iteration, we have an international commission, this time headed by the president of Ethiopia, Her Excellency Madam Sahle-Work Zewde, which frankly is a pretty significant change from the past. There's also, as Elise mentioned, a very robust global consultation and co-construction dimension that's already engaged about 750,000 people worldwide through events like this, through online platforms that close to 100,000 people have participated in, and also through focus groups that have been organized by UNESCO and partners, totaling right now around 345,000 participants from across the globe. Now, when we began the project, when we launched it in September of 2019 at the UN General Assembly, I think at the time, people thought that Futures of Education was a nice, fine, nice to have project, but not necessarily a need to have project. And then with COVID, you know, there's very much the sense with many that the future has arrived, the future is now argument. And I think we're all correctly aware that this is a really potent, powerful moment. Many decisions made now in the short term are going to have significant long-term future shaping consequences. And quickly, I think there's a couple of key lessons to draw. You know, one is it's worth remembering that every scenarios exercise that was run over the past 30 years included a global health pandemic that shut down economies and societies. So in a sense, we were hit by the train that we've been seeing come for decades. And maybe the lesson there is that we can do the foresight work pretty well, but we need to get a lot better at the anticipation part. Another lesson we might draw from COVID is that successful futures literacy is in part about coming to terms with the reality, the inevitability of uncertainty, and recognizing that some of our quests for certainty might actually get us into more trouble. So part of anticipating the future is recognizing that it's fundamentally unknowable and open. And I think COVID has been useful in showing us that dramatic change is possible. In many parts of the world, we saw basically overnight just how quickly change can occur. Of course, problems don't just magically disappear, but fundamental transformations in how we organize our economic life, social life, educational life are possible. And that possibility of transformation, I think, is another lesson we can draw from the pandemic. However, I would caution, because I think we sometimes see this in education conversations these days. I would caution, you know, as much as we do need to build in pandemic resilience, we shouldn't assume that that prepares us to face all possible futures. we should remember that future disruptions are likely to continue to come from both expected and unexpected angles. So in UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative, we're basically taking the position that it's very important for all of us to expand our capacities to imagine many possible future scenarios. So possible futures might include jobless societies, might include bioenhancement that fundamentally reshapes human beings, might include a drastic reduction in spaces of the planet that are suitable to human habitation, but possible futures might also be wondrous and full of abundance. So what we're doing is taking predicted and probable futures into consideration alongside desired and alternative futures. And I think the real value of unsettling assumptions, expanding the range of the possible, lies then in bringing those perspectives into present action. So let me now offer just a quick word on the SDGs and why we use the horizon of 2050 and beyond in the project. Of course, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a great milestone and a key reference point. It recognizes the persistent and growing challenge of inequality, the unsustainability of carrying current development patterns into the future, and it presents an alternative vision of a more inclusive world with a greater likelihood of survival. The SDGs, of course, also commit us to leaving no one behind. They require that we address poverty and marginalization. And I think one way to think about the SDGs is that they commit us to repairing damage done to the planet and the ecosystems that compose it. Ecosystems which of course support us and which we too as human beings are a part. The SDGs commit us to partnership, to collective action, and the agenda, I think, critically, usefully recognizes that challenges are global, they're complex, they're interrelated, and consequently, they require strengthened international collaboration and solidarity. So thinking beyond 2030, towards a horizon of 2050 means we do need to move beyond the SDG agenda and think about the world we want to shape. You know, the latest scientific assessments indicate that the scale and implications of climate change are much more severe than anticipated when the SDGs were adopted. I mean, just think of the UN Secretary General's recent warning that we're headed towards a thundering temperature rise of 3 to 5 degrees this century. I also think that it's clear that we need to pay more attention to the scale of technological transformations that are underway and their implications for the future. Artificial intelligence, digitalization, machine learning algorithms are pervading, working their ways into more and more areas of human living, which of course brings great possibilities, but also dangers. I would say most fundamentally though, there's a bit of a contradiction in some of the ideological underpinnings of the SDG model. While social justice and environmental stewardship are key guiding principles, I think we need to question a continued belief in economic growth as the main driver of development and instead expand our notions of what we mean by development, particularly so that we can bring our societies within the carrying capacity of the planet, within planetary boundaries. One of the principles of the Futures of Education initiative, one of the key ideas that is emerging all over the place is the notion that our collective capacity to thrive in the coming century is going to require a massive collective effort. It's going to require intense stewardship of the common goods that human beings across the world share together. I I think it's important for us to think about education as probably one of the most important global commons, on the order of water, atmosphere, biodiversity in its importance for thriving futures. So thinking about education as a global common good means recognizing the diverse knowledge resources of humanity. It means recognizing the collective processes of education that use and add to that commons. It means recognizing the infrastructures that support learning and knowledge creation, you know, from the great university libraries and research laboratories to local village schools, you know, from crowdsourced online encyclopedias to the professional education of teachers. You know, as a common good, education needs to be a collective endeavor through which all benefit. And when we add the adjective global, when we think of it as a global common good, that's an invitation for us to think about shaping education so that it's open to and involves everyone across the planet, while of course remaining attuned to the fact that it's used and employed and developed uniquely in local contexts. So, you know, right now, it's the work of the International Commission to elaborate what this means in terms of policy guidance, but that's a co-constructed, you know, collective activity. I think that's the work of all of us. The Commission itself will be issuing a report to come out in November of 2021, but the report is really just a step in an ongoing process of global dialogue and discussion. So maybe I'll just close with what I think is one really important aspect of doing work on education futures broadly. It's that we are, one, thinking about education in the future, and two, thinking about education for the future. They're very different concepts and activities, but we need to do both at the same time. And this is how we move from reacting to changes to shaping change. So I'll close with that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for all these very good points that you've made, especially also this need for thorough and very strong transformation. And we will see what the two next speakers will have to say about that before entering the further debate. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Dzulkifli Abdul Razak, who's the Rector of the International Islamic University Malaysia. You were the Vice Chancellor of University Science Malaysia from 2000 to 2011, and you are also the immediate past president of the International Association of Universities. Always been very pleased to work with you on advancing sustainable development at higher education, and I hope I continue in the right way today. So you're the fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, the World Academy of Art and Science, and the World Academy of Islamic Management as well, among many other things that you can also read online. But these are important to mention because it's also with those hats on that you speak to us today. You also sit on the advisory board of the Institute for Sustainable Development and Learning at Leuphana University since 2019. And you've recently been appointed as a member of the Qatar Foundation for the Development of Higher Education Strategy. So I'm advisory panel, sorry, and I would like to give you the floor and speak on those topics of the future of higher education, also from Malaysian and Asian perspectives, but probably also globally. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elish. Nice to be with you again, and fellow panelists, Noah and Larissa. Thanks for the invitation. I would try as much as possible to translate some of the things that Noah had been saying into the little experience that we've got in this new university that I've been here for the last 2.5 years, the International Islamic University. So there's some experimentations that we have done, given the previous experience in another university to see how we can do the whole institution transformation, which is the crux of the whole issue as far as sustainable development moving forward is concerned. So here you are. I think basically, let me just introduce in the year 2018, when I joined the university in middle of that year, we created a kind of a roadmap, a plan of how to do it, to integrate what we call the sustainable development goal with our own actual understanding of what sustainable development goal is in the local context, in the cultural context. And I want you to note the whole institution transformation is the way for us to move forward. We are quite happy to also accept April last year that we are one of the youngest regional centers of expertise for sustainable development, recognized by United Nations University in Tokyo. And I think in July, we won the Green Gown International Award. And I think Helish is the person who also announces this. So this gives us some credibility to say some of the things that we've been working, and I hope it really meets the expectation of what this is all about. Now, when I come to the university, like all other universities, at least in this part of the world, they are all very siloed. I think this is one of the biggest problems if we want to look at transformation. And our first task was basically how to get rid of the silos, how to get out of the comfort zones that we have been used to. This university has been here for the last 37 years, and the silos are basically the main blocking or barriers to move forward, let alone talk about sustainability. So what we do is basically to remove the silos by creating what we call flagship programs. In other words, going to all the faculties and finding out what they are good at, and then build a kind of a common platform that other faculties and other members of the community and students can join in. And so we have, at the end of last year, about 29 flagship programs that cut across many of the disciplines within the university. And it is just to test the ground whether people are ready to share and co-create the way we have always mentioned it in the kind of moving forward. What we discover that people are beginning to get comfortable in working together and moving out of their comfort zone and creating what we call and what we hope to be the new learning ecosystem within the university. And this, I think, allows us, after the 2 years of working, creating what we call different platforms of looking what education will be like to contribute to the learning ecosystem, as it were. I think we have mentioned this a number of times. How do we integrate people together, curriculums together, and even pedagogy at that particular point in time to make it as much as possible transdisciplinary, and so that there is no sort of segmentation in sharing information and also co-creating information. I think one of the biggest things that we have done, we have kind of quote unquote abolished exams and look at this more on the question of impact rather than the high impact. I mean, for us, it's always a high impact factor. When we talk about research, we are not talking about just the numbers, we are talking what is the impact. How do you translate the so-called high impact factors into impact in real life? And this is where I think the whole notion of examination has been minimized, and many of the courses now have no exams per se, but giving you what is happening on the ground as a kind of assessment that is not done by only the university, but also the community around. So community becomes a very important site for us to actually learn and translate what we have done, and also learn from them what is it that we have forgotten in terms of traditional wisdom and also the heritage of the community around us that will lead to a kind of a transformation. We have moved this in the last 3 years. I will show you some examples later on, but we think this is not enough. We need to add in research. So we create what we call responsible research innovation. And responsible innovation means for us is basically how do we work with the people who are actually impacted by the research. So it's not a research that is an armchair research that we normally do in our own labs, not taking consideration of people around us. So the responsible research and innovation takes them on board at the same time as part and parcel of the research team, as you were. And all the action and solutions then will be marked by them, and they will also be part and parcel of the people who tells us what is right and what is wrong. At the end of the day, will tell us whether this is impactful for them or not. Now, to do this, I think the whole university has revised its curriculum in a way that we've got what we call university core courses on sustainable development that every student must take part. So every new student must be part and parcel of the core course SDG that will then lead into what we call the new learning environment that transforms education as such. The flagship that I started with before now being translated into academic programs, academic curriculum, and they're no longer projects as it were. It becomes a part and parcel of the university curriculum and also the core courses that students and staff needs to participate. Yeah. So most of this, in fact, all of this are now contextualized on the 17 SDG. In fact, we are trying to create another SDG, which is called spirituality, which is part and parcel of the other block that we are trying to build in terms of culture, in terms of things that is almost intangible. How do you build this? And that is now being faced in what we call our own, Sejahtera academic framework. This framework now is a new framework of what we call humanizing education. For Rahmatan lil Alamin is our word of saying mercy to all. In other words, somebody was saying all forms of life, not only human life, but also the life of animals and environments and the ecological system surrounding, taking into consideration what the COVID has mentioned to us. So this framework now becomes the platform of how the university move forward in trying to create this new learning environment to be transformative and to co-create and to co-learn from one another. Now, this has been my own surprise to see how students particularly take into this like duck to water. I think there is something that they've been thinking of, and when we provide the system, which talks about first empowerment, and then the flexibility of running the system, including being innovative and also being accountable. These four elements are the one that drives many of these initiatives that we are talking today. Now, the university then revises itself by looking at different things. We are looking at, for example, how can we be international, cultural, and experiential at the same time? How do you provide not just high touch, but also high touch, and not just high tech, but high touch community engagement. So it's not all technology. It's also how do we interact with them, building relationship, building trust, and to a certain extent, building empathy at the same time. And this is where we hope that the graduates that we will create will be a balanced graduate that goes into our own tagline. We have got a tagline called the Garden of Knowledge and Virtue, which talks about the integration of knowledge within the environment and looking at values at the same time, not just hard facts or KPIs that we understand it. The responsible research and innovation will work with the international, cultural, experiential learning to build what we call this framework that I've mentioned to you about, that directs itself not only to Malaysia, but hopefully beyond Malaysia into the larger spheres around the world. And finally, how do we stay relevant and build a kind of a citizenship, as have been mentioned earlier. And this is where we talk about the society as such, the question of well-being, which is now heightened up in the context of COVID and post-COVID environment. Yeah, so we try to build what we call a form of spirituality, value-driven, so that people can be more resilient as far as issues of lockdown and all the things that we talked about in terms of depression, anxiety, and in fact mental health as well. And last but not least, interacting with research to create new values. And these values become part and parcel of how we maintain sustainability within the whole university. And that gives us a total picture of how this university now is organizing itself, very different from what it used to be pre-COVID just two years ago. On that note, I think we talk about this humanizing education, looking at the maqasid, which is about the local understanding of sustainability and integrating it into sustainable development goal. So the desire is to work to create competent leadership based on the mission of the university, taking on what we call leading the way. And these are the values that we talk about that we want to create within the ambit of the curriculum and also the students and staff that we produce. They have to be knowledge versatile. They'll be able to connect, not only in terms of virtual, but also a face-to-face thing, which we think is still important. So at the end of the day, it's about creating a blended environment rather than one or the other. Then it looks at how do we balance between building results and relationship when we talk about connectivity, so that the leadership becomes a balanced leadership. At the end of the day, we go into this whole idea of equitable prosperity, balancing the mind and the heart, and at the end of the day, creating what we call sustainable ecosystem that looks at inclusivity, ingenuity, and also intangibility, which has not been talked about in many aspects of education, at least in Malaysia, and I think it's worldwide at the same time, to be the strategic initiative. So this is where we now reorganize the whole institution as we move forward to take in the framework that I mentioned to you earlier. How do we do on this? Yeah, and taking the humanizing education away. So these are the initial impact assessment that we looked at. We found out, first of all, from these courses, the student alone has produced more than 300 proposals to be submitted to the university for consideration as a kind of a community engaged work. Yeah, some of them have done quite a good diagnostic in terms of how are we performing in terms of sustainability issues. Right, this will allow us to do a kind of a post-mortem and see where we can do improvement. Some of them has produced videos, posters, and these are now all over our website, and students are now evaluating and learning from one another given this kind of production. There are reflective journals. For the first time, the students are expressing themselves and say what is good and what do they learn away from just the conventional way of looking at sustainability the way it was done before. And last but not least, I think we have now even published articles, not only in journals, but also in mass media and also other media at the same time. Now, what does this do to us in the context of organizational impact? I can at least name 3 or 5. One is we have created these learning platforms, which is now being accessed by our peers. We have created a lot of collaborative initiatives, not only within the university, but also together with other partners. We've got 20 partners around to work on some of this project that we'll talk about. It is very human-centric, not just technology. I know the tendencies to talk about technology, but where the human being in this particular context is also another issue. In other words, we are beginning to talk about the intangibles, not just the objectivity that we talked about earlier, but how do you manage this in the context of values when we look at some of the impacts and creating a broader values-based system as far as education is concerned. Yeah, let me. How do we do? And this, I think, probably the recognition that we looked at. I mentioned to you, we are now the regional centers of expertise. We've won that golden green ground international award. But just recently, I think just a month ago, we submit some of these programs that the students have been doing to a kind of a competition run by Okayama, I think, part of it. And we submitted 11 sort of proposal, and 8 of it got some sort of a recognition. 2 outstanding flagship, 3 memorable mentions, and 3 acknowledged flagship, meaning to say that some of the things that we do has got its own relevance now in trying to shape this into the futures of education, given the framework and the curriculum that we are trying to manage as we move forward. We're very thankful for this, and we hope we can move forward. And these are very quickly some of the posters that the student have taken up. I picked these up from the website. These are some of the writings that they do in the mass media and also in other print media and electronic media at the same time. All right, and these are some of the videos that they do. Meaning to say, there are now many of this coming out. We are now trying to develop what we call a knowledge management system, which is a repository that takes all of this so that they can be part and parcel of the tacit knowledge structure that is going to be built into the framework that we talked about. Yeah. So the next part is basically how to develop that database, is what I mentioned to you, where we talk about the knowledge management. And I think our IT people are building the so-called knowledge management structure that looks at whatever knowledge that is produced by the students. Now our students are also producers of knowledge. At the end of the day, this knowledge then will be stored into a repository that will build the whole, what you call, horizon of what sustainable development means as far as university is concerned, moving forward, hopefully into the future, post-COVID or otherwise, all right? So I guess I stop there. Thank you very much, and I hope we can discuss it at a later point. Thank you.
Elise, I think we're not hearing you, your audio. Larissa, you're not either. I'm not sure.
No, I'm not.
We're still not hearing you.
There you go.
I hope you know. So I wanted to say that it's always very difficult to stop somebody with such passion and so much to contribute, because it is also giving the recipe on how whole of institution approach to sustainable development works. And what it also shows is that it takes a very committed leader who's actually also combining life and work together in one and the same, I would say. And I see the university in the garden that you started at University Sains Malaysia being repeated at the university where you are today, which is a beautiful metaphor of the very dynamics of planting the seeds of the future in people who will then take the leadership on SD in society. I would like to turn to Larissa Bezo now and offer you the opportunity to complement in a very nice manner this panel where we go from a global perspective to a very strong example from an institution to also a country and international other dynamic. Larissa Bezo has served as senior leadership in various senior leadership positions in both the public and not-for-profit sectors, including as deputy clerk and deputy cabinet secretary in the government of Saskatchewan. You've been a senior advisor to a federal royal commission and most recently interim president and chief executive officer for the Canadian Bureau for International Education. You've demonstrated a long-standing commitment to international development and solidarity, and that's where you connect very well as well to the two previous presentations, I think, in mind and spirit. And you've worked within boards of directors and executive committees to define strategic priorities and oversee their implementation. And I'm sure you will share a lot there as well on how to turn plans for the future into reality. So the floor is yours, Larissa.
Thank you. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm connecting to all of you from Ottawa, Canada, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And I'm really grateful and humbled to have the opportunity to connect with you and want to acknowledge the first inhabitants of this land from which I'm connecting. Zul, it was really great to be able to hear about some of the tremendous initiatives that you're leading within your institution. I was smiling as I was listening because it very much connects, I think, to a lot of the efforts that we as an organization at CBIE over the course of, in particular, I would say the last year, have really been seeking to create spaces and kind of use the platform of our association to create room for our higher education institutions across Canada to connect and to really learn from one another in terms of the work that they're doing in trying to contribute to the sustainable development agenda. And I think, you know, one simply needs to consider those various intersections that both Noah and Yuzul have talked about, identified among different sectors. You know, take, for example, education, gender, health, you know, or energy, security, poverty eradication, to understand the critical role that our post-secondary institutions can and should be playing in leading that cross-sectoral initiative and those efforts to advance that sustainable development agenda. And, you know, also to your point, Noah, to I think more broadly think beyond 2030 in terms of, you know, the futures of education and how we not only contribute to the future in education, but also the future for education. You know, as we've all experienced in recent years, I think this work really necessitates not only explicit commitment, as we heard very vividly from Zul, but, you know, as we've been sharing and creating spaces to engage with our Canadian institutions, I think there's a growing acknowledgement that this has required really fundamental change at the level of our institutions. And so our focus as an association has really been about trying to create space for the sharing, for the learning, to broaden kind of minds and perspectives of those on the front lines in those international relations offices, in those internationalization offices, to really think about how we operationalize this from that lens. And, you know, from the conversations that we've been having, we've hosted kind of a sustainable development podcast series, a series of webinars that have been quite global in nature. In terms of the institutional engagement, there are a lot of kind of threads that have come out of those conversations, but I thought what I would do is perhaps highlight some of the key threads of conversation that have emerged, and that I think will continue to be really important threads for conversation as we move forward, certainly in the Canadian space. And I think acknowledging, as I mentioned, that, you know, it really not only necessitates kind of clarity and explicit commitment, but I think fundamental change at the institutional level. I think there's been a growing acknowledgement from kind of the early days of experience from institutions that have really begun to kind of make explicit their commitments to the Sustainable Development Agenda since 2015. I think a recognition that this requires not only changes in mindsets, changes in institutional culture, changes in strategic direction, even structural changes in institutional governance and in human resource capacity to allow for this meaningful work to unfold. Certainly there's been acknowledgement that I think our institutions can and should play a lead role kind of in strengthening that science policy interface. And, you know, I think we all acknowledge and recognize that universities certainly have the capacity to engage in collaborative knowledge generation alongside other stakeholders, you know, leading to that co-production and co-creation. But I think equally important, and I think in particular during this very difficult time where we see kind of increased cleavages, increased vulnerability, this tendency to be much more inward in our thinking as we all globally live through this pandemic, is I think the important role that our institutions can play in serving as politically neutral platforms for that cross-sectoral dialogue. And I think, you know, one of the comments that had come up in a webinar that we hosted last fall talking about this was, you know, we're at a critical juncture globally, and where politicians are busy putting up walls, universities should be throwing open the doors and creating those spaces for conversation. And not only conversation, but then distilling that into concrete action. And further, that our institutions are really there to serve to strengthen kind of cross-disciplinary learning and engagement through education. And that's where the link to the whole notion of global citizenship and global stewardship and both kind of human-centered and I think world-centered views. I know our own former Governor General, David Johnston, you know, has for many years talked about in the Canadian context, you know, Canada really being, you know, a learning nation, you know, and challenging many of us who are engaged in the post-secondary space to think about what that really means. And you know, and I think the challenge, you know, that he put to us was really to think about the degree to which, you know, our institutions and our sector can really serve to develop global citizens. I mean, our institutions are responsible for training and shaping those future leaders of sustainable development. And I think there are very kind of concrete operational elements that can be embedded, you know, in integrating the SDGs, for example, into curricula, providing students, you know, not only with the knowledge, but also skills needed to address these challenges and, you know, challenges that go well beyond the Sustainable Development Agenda, but also establishing, you know, educational programs that emphasize interdisciplinary learning or that promote multidisciplinary systems and approaches to solving those increasingly complex challenges facing societies today. I remember a few years ago being struck as we were talking about kind of beginning to talk about the future of work and the future of society, you know, and the reality that, you know, many of the jobs that exist, many of the jobs that we need, for example, to address, you know, the future of our society and the future of the planet don't even exist at this point in time. And so trying to think very broadly in terms of, you know, what will be those future needs and how do we think about mobilizing efforts to get to that point that Noah talked about in terms of that kind of massive collective effort that's required to address these many, many challenges. And those challenges certainly go far beyond the pandemic. And as we've been thinking about that, I mean, our organization has really been trying to create the spaces to have the conversations with institutions, you know, and I think, you know, one of the challenges is trying to really build bridge, let's say, the strategic objectives, and perhaps that kind of strategic plan for the planet, as one of our colleagues from Georgia Tech had put it when we talked about the Sustainable Development Agenda. How do we translate that, operationally into reality? And I think the challenge, as we've been having these conversations in the Canadian context, is how do you make the linkages between kind of the overarching kind of framework and link that to the national frameworks, and then distill that down into the role of institutions within local communities. And I think in large part, success in terms of advancing some of those objectives is very much hinges on that. I mean, we recognize that our higher education institutions have a very significant presence in our communities, and certainly are uniquely positioned to anchor both economic and social developments. But the challenge then becomes, how do we support them? How do we create the spaces for kind of peer learning? And how do we encourage that type of bold leadership that's required to then be able to advance that and make progress in a way that can then be rolled up. And at our annual conference last November, we kind of continued the conversation we've been having over the course of the year. Our Stephen Lewis, Canada's former envoy to the UN, had joined us as part of that conversation. I know one of the challenges that he had put to our education sector was, you need to think boldly, and this is a time to really take action, but also be discreet in that, likely focusing on a couple of explicit priorities, a couple of distilled elements. You'll probably be in a position to make a more significant impact rather than diluting your efforts and focusing on, the broad range of objectives. And so certainly that requires a degree of coordination, but he really challenged us to think very specifically around particular areas where our post-secondary institutions could have and make the most meaningful impact, from local to national to global communities and frameworks. And I think connected to this, as we're going through these transformations at a societal level, there really is a reconceptualization of the purpose and mission of our post-secondary institutions that's underway at the moment. And I think, we're increasingly seeing our own Canadian institutions looking at, and in a very explicit ways, so whether that be articulating that through their strategic frameworks and strategic plans, but really having concrete conversations with their own local communities about the impact that they can have on the real quality of life in their societies, to the point that Zul had made as he was sharing what was driving their own institutional efforts, and the fundamental role of our institutions in terms of the connection then to society and to serving society, and going back to that touch point as an anchor. And certainly, the research collaboration, the partnerships, all of those different dimensions of international engagement certainly serve to reinforce that. Those were the things that I wanted to just share and highlight. As I say, the conversation is ongoing from the Canadian perspective. We certainly have a lot to learn. I think we've been incredibly touched and humbled by the extent to which our partners abroad and many, many institutions globally have been open to engaging with us in this conversation. We certainly don't have all of the answers, but I think what we're trying to do is to create space to support one another through this, and also to create space to be able to share that learning and make connections, so that there is a way, and perhaps, I think there are many ways of approaching, moving ahead and making those connections between the local, national, and global dimensions of these considerations. But I think increasingly, certainly from our organizational standpoint, we want to continue to advance that and to contribute to not only helping, make Canada a learning nation, but to the extent to which we can, through our own internationalization efforts, really seek to advance that and that connectedness on a global level. Thanks for letting me share.
Wonderful, thank you very much. There are some of the questions that appeared in the chat that actually along the way seem to have been addressed, but I will start with two that are addressed to Noah, and any of you can come in because they are actually applicable to all. So Emma, identified as Emma in the chat box, says that she completely agrees about the need to shift ideological underpinnings from economic model of development towards a social model. How can UNESCO and other non-governmental organizations support this, including universities? And then a question linked to that, and then I turn to you, Noah, first, but then maybe the two other speakers can come in on that question as well. For Noah again, but maybe to others, what discussions, conversations, and publications have UNESCO been involved with regarding the needed shift in paradigm focus from economic development as fundamental good to development in its other values. Any resources for reference would be most valuable. So probably in the chat you may link up to UNESCO, and you did a bit, but that would be good. And I believe that from university perspective, or from where you sit, Larissa, you can also provide input for this. And then finally, linked to this and to all, what would you see in terms of a role for intercultural learning in the whole process towards a more sustainable world? So, Noah, can I give you the floor first?
Sure, I'll be very quick. I mean, one thing, and I think we're seeing it with COVID already, is just to avoid a knee-jerk instinctive turn to GDP as the measure that we should be using. I mean, just remember that's a proxy that we use to think about well-being broadly, and we clearly need to diversify and pluralize those indicators. So I mean, that's one specific thing. You know, I think the SDG agenda, you know, moves us in that direction. It's clearly you know, usefully, importantly, surfacing a whole host of other, you know, indicators that we need to use when we assess, you know, the results of our work. So I'll stop with that. Maybe my colleagues want to come in and save time for other questions too.
Yeah. And Dzul, would you like to pick up on this as well? We don't hear you, do we?
Okay. When we look at this, I think we are looking at the post-COVID environment as something which is totally different from what pre-COVID environment is as far as education is concerned. For a start, for example, in this part of the world, we talk about marketability, employability, and all those things. That is supposed to be, quote unquote, the purpose of education, to provide employment, livelihood, and so on and so forth. That has been well grounded. But when COVID comes in, the first institution to close down are the industries. The economics lockdown, and for our students, be asking us now. You told us when we work with the industry, you're going to get employment and so on and so forth. Now, what happened now? So these people who have been providing us with, you know, hopes of the future now suddenly closed down, and the university can never close down. So I think we go back and find out what is education for. We go back and to repurpose education, and this is where when we come with the framework that I talked to you about. I can elaborate it a little bit more, but perhaps there's no time. But in summary, we talk about the pre-COVID environment as far as education is what we call the 4 M's. We were about talking about manpower, training the mind, training the brains, yeah, and using technology, machine, which is high tech. And finally, it's all about the marketplace. This is how we see education in the pre-COVID environment. What the post-COVID tells us, you can never survive alone anymore. So we need to expand the whole idea of manpower to humanity, right? We cannot just talk about the heart, the head. You need to talk about the heart when you talk about well-being and so on. So there's another dimension, another H. Right? We cannot just talk about high tech, we talk about high touch. I mentioned about high touch. Okay? At the end of the day, we are not talking just about the marketplace, we are talking about how to humanize the whole system, as it were. So we're moving from 4M to 4H. And this 4H tells us something. When we want to talk about humanity, you must have the value of sympathy. If you don't have the value of sympathy, then you will never understand what humanity is all about. You cannot understand poverty by just sitting in your desk, you know, in your room, and trying to imagine what poverty is all about. So you need to go down, and therefore the value of empathy comes in. You need to really toil and work, you know, across borders, across culture, and across whatever the barriers that we've got. And last but not least, a value of compassion. Now, these 3 values, I think, needs to be embedded in our education system so that people can also feel, not just know, but they can also feel at the same time. And this is where I thought learning to becomes a very, very important sort of pillar. To become what? To become human again. And education to make us a better human being before we even become a better engineer. But I think that's not the case today. Everybody wants to be a better engineer. That could be the lousiest human being. And you can see this all over the world when you talk about the pandemic. Yeah, how human being misbehave, quote unquote, despite humanity being threatened. And I think there's something wrong with our education system, the foundation of it, that needs to be revisited. And the definition also we will question. We talk about definition, what we call the present, not compromising the future, but we're asking what happened to the past. Why is the past being left out? Sustainable development is not a concept that is born 30 years ago. It was concept in many indigenous population being hundreds and hundreds years ago. And we did our study, we look at Bali, we look at Bhutan, we look at other places in Asia. Sustainability has been there for a long time. So it's not new. So we need to go and revisit the past also, learn the wisdom of the past and mainstream it into what education ought to be. And this is where the human centricity becomes important as far as we're concerned. And doing that, I think, needs a lot more reorganization, rather than looking at the university as another factory, producing another goods for the industry, and that's about it. I think that needs to be revised, and this is what we're attempting to do.
Okay, so the centrality of values as well is also what you're advocating for. It's a bit of a shortcut, but indeed. And Larissa, would you?
Absolutely. I mean, this for me, as I was listening to Dzul speak, and I agree. But for me, it linked back to a conversation that was taking place yesterday during the conference around intercultural competency. And I think there were some really, really important points made yesterday around the critical importance of us applying kind of an intersectional lens to how we engage in education, and certainly in global education. But at the core, I think there are some difficult questions we need to be asking ourselves, because I agree that kind of a human-centered and and that priority around kind of cultivating compassion and empathy and understanding is really important. But I think it gets back to some very fundamental issues and questions that relate to identity, that relate to, a sense of belonging, that relate to where we place value around knowledge and whose knowledge, thinking kind of beyond the level of nations to a much more globalized context. And I think those, and then, it then takes us to the conversation around a lot of, the systemic barriers that exist. There are pedagogical ones, certainly, but I think there are systemic limitations that hold us back. And that certainly, I would say, disproportionately, I think, affect and marginalize, many versus some who are perhaps, in a better position to benefit. And so I think those are some of the fundamental questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we rip this open and think about the futures of education. Because in the absence of dealing with those, in the absence, for example, I know we're having very painful but very necessary conversations and trying to kind of just be still and listen when it comes to the North American context and thinking about anti-racism practices. How do we address these issues? How do we create those spaces to really meaningfully look at our own biases and our own filters? We as the ones who are leading those institutions, we as the ones who are creating frameworks within which new policies are being shaped and trying to anticipate, those different scenarios and those different alternative futures or opportunities. I think, I think there is a reflective piece here that needs to happen alongside, thinking big and thinking boldly and looking forward, because I think it's only when we get real with those issues that we're really going to be able to take that very human-centered, that very empathetic and compassionate approach. So I just wanted to add that because I think it was a really powerful conversation yesterday that I just wanted to weave into today's plenary.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then Noam, I will give you each 1.5 minutes to give one extra comment. And then unfortunately, a plenary is only an hour. We have lots of food for thought, but we can't go much further. So 1/2 minute, Noah?
1/2 minute. So I mean, I agree entirely with Jul's point about humanizing education and Larissa's point about needing to engage in reflection. I'll just say that this is we're involved in the conversation about sustainability and inclusion. I get a little nervous when we use the phrase human-centered. What I would suggest we center are our relationships, with the planet, with technology and machines, and with each other. That's what I think we need to put at the center. So I think that was maybe close to 30 seconds. Over to the next.
Certainly. Thank you. So, Dzul, you have the right to respond to that one or say something in half a minute.
Yeah, I mean, for us, human-centric is a whole ecosystem. But we human being relates to ourselves, between human beings. We relate within ourselves, and we relate to the environment. So this the 3 dimension of the SDG is within us, not outside there. And therefore, we want to make sure that we understand that internally, not just externally. Right now, I think it's very external. We talk about how to change the environment, but we ourselves, we have not changed. And I think that's what human centricity means to us, and how do you humanize it through education is what we are talking today. But I get your point, Noah. But yeah, that may be the issue that we want to address now. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And then Larissa, maybe you can say just a little bit more about these systemic barriers that exist. And also when we talk about multi or transdisciplinarity, something that I've heard in the previous days as well, and in this conversation, and that is so difficult to put in place. So maybe you want to say just 1 minute something about that.
Sure, and I certainly don't claim to have any of the answers, but we're certainly committed to trying to create the spaces to have the conversation and to learn from one another. I do want to acknowledge Noah's point and agree. I think for me, fundamentally, you know, similar to Zul, when I think about that kind of that human-centered piece, at the end of the day, it's really about questioning the roles that we as individuals can play in contributing, right, to that advancement, to those connections and relationships. And I think that's really where I was approaching it from. In terms of the systemic elements, I mean, I think that's a challenging one to unpack in the sense that there are so many layers to it, and I think it comes back to those relationships, and I think the responsibility that we each have in those relationships to ask the hard questions. You know, we talked a lot about that at our conference. You know, to question our privilege, to, you know, really think about our own sense of belonging or how we relate to others. But in the first instance, I think take the opportunity to learn and open the door to those conversations. There's just so much that we don't see from our own blindness. And I think that's core to addressing all of those systemic barriers. There are too many to name at this point. But I think, you know, recognizing that, you know, each of us who engage in those relationships are very complex beings that bring multiple identities to each and every interaction, to each and every relationship, I think is probably the most important, you know, piece for us to recognize, because then it allows us to approach every one of those interactions with humility and with some openness in terms of perhaps reimagining what it should be, or allowing others to challenge, you know, our own assumptions. And I think we're certainly seeing that from, you know, CBIE's work with our institutions and across the sector, that it's really about creating that space to challenge ourselves to do better. And when we know better, to do even better.
Wonderful. And I hope that all of this conversation and others during this conference will also be of interest to the International Commission of the Futures of Education through you, Noah, that you can bring this back somehow also to the other conversation. And if you wish to liaise, obviously, with Dzul and Larissa beyond this conversation, and with the members of the organizing committee at York, they will be available and very pleased to also embark in future conversations to help inform the report that will come out. I'm sure that everybody will look out for that and also will be pleased to comment and maybe get involved. I'm only sorry that the conversation has to stop here, but I would like to also remind everybody that during this virtual conference, there are also cultural contributions that play a very important role also in our lives, and we need to support it, and that's what the conference is also doing. And so this is to enhance the conference experience for everyone throughout the whole program. As the cultural sector is particularly hit during this pandemic, we're supporting culture and the diversity to which culture owes its strengths. And so I'm very pleased to introduce the singer AI from Tokyo, Japan, and it is called Not So Different. So thank you.